Welcome to Spatial Thinking. This PowerPoint should give you the background information needed as we get ready to work on the PASST project. Please know that the information taken from this PowerPoint was put together by Phil Gershmel. Phil is a member of the Michigan Geographic Alliance and an active researcher. Originally from the University of Minnesota, Phil has done extensive work on spatial thinking and how the 5 themes of geography relate to the different types of spatial thinking. This PowerPoint will cover some of those main points. The 5 themes, we all know, are a guide for lesson design, because they tend to describe how geographers think. The standards put together from the National Geography group are a guide for that curriculum design. They describe the what, or the what types of things that we think about. So let's talk about why and how those types of thinking and those findings are important to the work that we're going to do as part of the PASST project. To get a true sense of where the thinking comes from, it's necessary to go back to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was seen during his time of work as the central figure in modern philosophy. According to Kant, humans had 3 built-in ways of organizing information from experience. That information tended to be organized either temporally, spatially, or causally. In other words, by time, by space, or by cause. What the mind contributes is a set of abstract conceptual frameworks that tend to organize our experience. Those experiences tend to be, again, organized by space, time, or causation, not by the 5 themes or through the 5 themes of geography. For many decades, the American education system had a kind of Kantian curriculum, if you will. In other words, the history and science focused on looking at causal relationships. We know now that things are a little bit different. We also know that geographers, when they try to do their work and ask their questions, seek to understand information and organize information in different ways. So let's talk about how those different ways of organizing information can be related to the 5 themes of geography. Region, for example, is a kind of spatial thinking. It's not a thing. It's one of the ways that ideas are organized, taking into consideration conditions, connections between various locations. But we do have to remember that it's not the only way of organizing information or thinking spatially. We have to go back and we have to think about how geographers really think. Most of their work, most of their thinking is done inductively. using different modes of spatial reasoning. These are important because they seem to engage different brain networks. Both conclusions have significant implications for curriculum, instruction, and of course, assessment. So to start a closer look at spatial thinking, let's look at a test question that uses a map. As we look at our first example, we can see that this is taken from the colonial time period of study, asking students which colony, for example, produced everything except for iron. The job of this map is simply to store facts. The way that this question is designed does not encourage or support spatial thinking. In fact, it's easier to find this information on a table or a graph. In short, this question does not assess geographic knowledge or spatial thinking. It's just a test of speed of visual search. Therefore, the big takeaway is this. Just because a prompt has a map in it, it doesn't necessarily make it geography. Unfortunately, many map questions on state assessments are like this. So we have to be very clear. Geographers do not make maps just to store facts about places. A map needs to be seen as a prompt for geographical analysis of spatial patterns, regions, sequences, associations, auras, hierarchy. You get the idea. We'll talk about those words in just a little bit. Here's another example. As a prompt for spatial thinking, map design is critical. The map should encourage readers to ask themselves, why are things located where they are? This takes the content expectation of locate a place on a map to another level. And that's what the science of cartography is all about. To illustrate different kinds of spatial thinking, let's look at another test question, this time in a little more detail, particularly at the choices. Which geographic feature of Spain and Portugal most enhanced their ability to engage in exploration? This was an actual assessment item taken from the New York Regents exam in August of 2008. So let's approach this from the standpoint of how a geographer might think about those choices. First of all, if we take a look at the first multiple choice foil, the fertile plain, a geographer might ask, are the conditions right? Thinking of pictures of Spain, they tend to show dry hills, rocky ground, shrubby trees, goats. While that thinking is going on, spatial association is also going on in another part of the brain. Geographers might be thinking ocean ports rarely occur together with mountains. Looking at yet the third foil, the extensive river system would cause spatial hierarchy types of questions to be asked in the geographer's brain. And the spatial hierarchy is a form of spatial thinking. For example, the geographer would think about some of the major rivers throughout the world. That would cause the geographer to realize that lists of major rivers seldom include any in the countries of Spain or Portugal. Therefore, through process of elimination and through engaging the multiple ways of thinking spatially, the last option might seem to be the most plausible of all four choices. However, the question now becomes about shape. Is the shape correct? Do Spain and Portugal look like peninsulas? The geographer might think about other examples of peninsulas, such as Florida or Baja California, possibly Normandy, or any other peninsulas that geographer might be familiar with. A thoughtful student might even reject this option after recalling the shapes of known peninsulas. What about analogous locations? In general, did places in similar positions have similar roles in history? More specifically, were all peninsulas important in the age of exploration? Again, thinking about the data that already comes to mind. The result of contemplation is no. People on many other peninsulas did not become explorers like those from Spain and Portugal. Peninsular location was not sufficient in order to participate in exploration. What about other explorer countries? Were those countries located on peninsulas or part of peninsulas? In order to answer that, a geographic comparison is needed. Take England, for example. England is an island. If we consider France, France is a river through a fertile plain. The Netherlands includes a deltaic floodplain, as is China. Italy is a peninsula, but we know that Italy's explorers came mostly from Genoa and Venice, located on the non-peninsular part of the country. The real reason is not on this list. Spain and Portugal were close to favorable winds and ocean currents. So, if we look at this question again, what can it tell us about geographic reasoning? Phil selected this question because, to evaluate the answers, a geographer might use many different ways of thinking about space. For example, analysis of shape, in other words, pattern, Is it a peninsula? What about spatial comparison? Other explorer countries, how do those comparisons come into play? Spatial association, ports with mountains. How does that fit in to answering the question? Spatial hierarchy, rivers inside countries. Which ones? And how do they relate to the question? And spatial analogy, other similar positions. Spatial auras. Are there ocean currents nearby? The reason this question was chosen for this slideshow was because it really demonstrates the multiple ways of thinking about space. For example, analysis of shape or pattern, spatial comparison, spatial association, hierarchy, analogy, and aura. These are multiple ways that students, that geographers, that we all think about space. So we have to make a shift in our thinking as educators. Whether we are designing lessons or designing assessments, we must move away from thinking categorically about the 5 themes of geography and shift our thinking to the multiple ways of thinking about patterns and relationships that are occurring when we're engaging in true spatial thinking. Assessments have to be constructed in a similar way. Geography should not be an add-on to what happens in world history. You cannot have one without the other. And assessments in our PASST project need to reflect that way of thinking. In the past 20 years, neuroscientists have discovered that different ways of thinking about space use different brain networks. Since 1990, there have been more than 3,500 studies that show that the human brain has distinct networks that do specific kinds of spatial thinking. And these networks occur throughout the entire portion of the brain. For example, one area of the brain, connections can be made that allow students in their spatial thinking to compare places. Another part of the brain is where students can define regions and make comparisons between places and proximity. Yet another part of the brain has students really thinking about or connecting spatially with the arrangements of features of places. Spatial hierarchies and the ability to identify those spatial hierarchies takes place in yet another part of the brain, as do associations, sequences, influences, and analogous positions. Bottom line, this is the type of spatial thinking that students are doing in our classes with geography integration. Like the different muscles in your arm, the brain has different structures that do different kinds of spatial thinking. We know that a good map reader knows which mode of spatial thinking to use to read a particular kind of map. Just like in the brain, it takes training, practice, and exercise in order to develop those muscles and keep them strong. The key pedagogical point is that different people do different kinds of spatial thinking with different levels of skill. Just like we know students develop at different rates. The biggest challenge is trying to design lessons, and in this case, PASST assessments that accommodate those differences. If we think about the Common Core, if we think about writing standards, for example, spatial reasoning is left out of Common Core work. Therefore, it's our job as we create PASST assessments to go beyond that omission.